Welcome. So I just first want to give a little shout out to one of my own programs. It's called Lunch in the Garden. It's a webinar series that we do Wednesdays at noon. And if you're around on Wednesdays at noon, you're certainly welcome to join us. If you'd like to be on the list to get the notifications, you can send me an email. It's dhc3@cornell.edu. And I'll put that up again at the end in case you want to jot that down. So this coming week, on October 14th, I think it is, we're going to be having a webinar about putting the garden to bed, done by a couple of our master gardeners, Becky Raymond and Pat Mulligan. And the following week, we're going to be talking about ornamental arrangements and fall decor with Denise Maurer, another one of our wonderful master gardeners. So that's Lunch in the Garden, and those are on Wednesdays at noon. So there's my commercial, and now we'll be commercial free as we talk about composting. So composting is a fun subject because it's about rot, it's about earthy things, it's about making kind of nature work for you. And I really enjoy talking about it. I've been composting myself. Well, I've been doing composting for myself since I was probably a young person. When I first got into gardening, maybe the age of 10 or so, I can remember my father bringing home some wire and we set up a compost bin. So I've been doing this a long time, and hopefully I have a few insights I can share with you. This PowerPoint is one that was made by Penn State. So I kind of took this and I've adapted this to what I wanted to say. So some of these are Penn State's photos. A lot of them are Penn State's photos, but I've thrown a few more of my own in here. So again, I'll just say, if you have a question, type it in the chat box and we'll get to it at the end. Okay, so what is composting? Composting is using the natural process of decay to change organic waste into a valuable humus-like material called compost. So it's pretty simple in a way that we can take these organic materials like grass clippings, food scraps, and leaves and turn them into this dark material. And I think if people haven't really thought about this or experienced this maybe in their life, they kind of think this is a miraculous thing. Back when I worked for Cooperative Extension in Westchester, we did a lot of composting education because the county was really trying to reduce the waste stream and how much the county had to deal with waste. So they were really pushing us, and really it was a great thing to talk about composting. And I would meet people that maybe they had grown up in New York City or the more urban parts of Westchester, and they would look at this compost and say, how did you get that? This turns into that. It was really quite amazing. If you have more of a rural background, you know that compost just sort of happens, but we can influence it as well. So composting is speeding up this natural decay process. We have a bin or a pile, and we control or have some influence over things like the air, the water, the food, or what we put into the compost pile, and maybe the temperature. So by managing these things, we can speed up the process. That pile there is going to naturally decay and become compost, whether we did anything or not, really. But we can make it happen faster if we want to by managing some of these factors. And that's what a lot of this program is about, talking about these factors and how you can manipulate this natural process into something that you control a little bit more. So again, it's organic material and oxygen, microbes, moisture, and time. And we have compost, CO2, and energy. So that's kind of a nice little diagram, kind of saying the same thing. And why should I compost? You know, some people just prefer to roll this stuff out to the curb. Maybe you live in a community where you don't have to compost. You've got pickup. I have a friend that lives in Niskayuna, and Niskayuna, if a branch falls off his tree way up in his yard, the town stops by and picks it up. They have incredible service. Whereas I live out in the country and we don't get a lot of service. You know, if there was something that really came down in my yard, I have to deal with it, or I can take it to the town recycling center. But why should I compost if I don't have to? Why should I? Well, I'm going to tell you a few things maybe that will influence you, or maybe you can use this on somebody that you want to influence. First off, composting keeps a lot of food waste or yard waste out of the municipal waste stream. And that's what we do send to the landfill or send to the recycling center, is picked up in garbage trucks and all of that. And that's about 25% of what people generate. So it really seems like quite a bit. You know, we think about all the paper and plastic we generate as a living person, but you're also generating food waste. And if you live in a house with a yard, you're generating yard waste, and it's really quite a lot of material. If we do this composting at home, we're going to reduce the cost for our local government. And, you know, everybody wants lower taxes, lower taxes. But what can we do to lower our taxes? Well, if we all composted, maybe our local governments, our county and our state government, could save a little money. Now, that may be a little pie in the sky, but at least in theory, that could happen. Number 3 is really my favorite. It makes a usable, valuable product from material that is really not waste, but really is valuable stuff. So food scraps are valuable. We have to think about them in a different way. And we can also reduce our carbon footprint by keeping these things home and composting them in place rather than using gas and diesel fuel to haul them around and get rid of them. And interestingly enough, I think it was last week I heard about Vermont's new law that, mandates food waste composting. And I looked into it a little bit. I think it's pretty much focused on food wastes, and you have to either take your food waste to a recycling center and where they're accepting that and they'll compost it, or you can have somebody pick it up for you and compost it, or you can compost it. But they really want to try to get the food waste out of Vermont's waste stream. So that is a really impressive thing, Vermont. Congratulations for you guys. So what do we need to make compost? Well, we need the decomposers. These are microbes that we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute that do all the work. And we need the food that we're going to give them, and those are the materials we're going to compost. So the right amount of air, water, and warmth is going to keep these guys working. And you might say, where do these guys come from? Well, where do decomposers come from? You don't really have to worry about that. That's one of the reasons why composting is so really easy in a lot of ways and kind of fun, because you don't have to worry about where these microbes come from. They're just out there. They're just everywhere. And if you have soil, leaves, food scraps, manure, finished compost, they are going to be the source for the microorganisms. So we don't have to add anything fancy to our compost pile to get it to work. It's going to be Mother Nature that adds those decomposers. So that's really quite magical and a gift from Mother Nature. There's a nice picture of compost. 1 teaspoon of good garden soil to which compost has been added contains 1 million bacteria and 800 feet of fungal threads. Now, how do they know that? Well, some poor graduate student, maybe at a place like Cornell, spent probably their master's thesis looking at that teaspoon of soil. God bless them, but it's really an interesting fact, right? There's a lot of life in that teaspoon of soil there, and it's being hosted by compost. So it's pretty interesting stuff. Now this slide is kind of as nitty-gritty as it gets for the decomposers themselves. We've got bacteria. They're important. They break down simple forms of organic matter. We've got actinomycetes, and that's one that I always think, now what the heck is an actinomycete? Well, I put in white there, I added that definition there. It's a microscopic soil-dwelling organism which has hyphae like a fungus that can split into individual cells like a bacteria. So it's classified as either a bacteria or a fungus. So it's another little interesting microscopic creature. It breaks down lots of things that plants are made from. Cellulose, lignin, chitin, which is part of insects as well, proteins. And the actinomycetes are responsible for that earthy smell that you might smell in a compost pile. Or also when it rains in the spring and you smell that wonderful earthy smell, that's the actinomycetes out there. And of course, we also have fungi, which break down the tough debris and help out the bacteria. So again, these guys are out there, they're doing the work, they're harmless. They're not going to be causing any pandemics. They're actually good guys and very important to us and to Mother Earth. So, you know, people do get sold on these compost additives sometimes. You can go to catalogs or nowadays on the internet. I'm sure you can find all sorts of compost stimulators, activators, bioactivators, what have you, that you can put in your compost pile, and this is to guarantee that this is going to decompose and work, but probably not really necessary. So again, you could save money and really skip these things. You know, if somebody gave me this for Christmas, I guess I'd put it in my compost pile, but I'm not going to run out and get this because I really don't need it. It's not really necessary. So again, back to the beginning again, kind of, what's the best food for these decomposers? Well, a lot of these organic wastes really are what you want to put into your compost pile. Garden trimmings, we're going to have a lot of that stuff coming up. Richard and I were talking about frost, and he's got a lot of his annuals that have been hit by the frost already, so I'm sure he's put those in his compost pile. I'll be cutting down my perennial garden, putting that in my compost pile. So all sorts of garden trimmings. Weeds are okay as long as they don't have seeds on them. If I'm out pulling weeds, especially in the summer, and there's a lot of seeds on weeds, I tend to put them in a different pile. I put them in what I call the nasty pile, and that's just a pile off to the side that is not really a compost pile because weed seeds can survive composting, but we'll talk about that more in a minute. Certainly kitchen scraps are important. We've really been getting pretty good here at my house about putting kitchen scraps in the compost pile in the last couple of years. And they're a really great source of greens, and we'll talk about why that's important in a minute. Grass clippings, if you happen to pick up your grass clippings, they can go in a compost pile. But I'm a proponent of leaving your clippings on the lawn, especially if you have a mulching mower. So you may not have to put clippings in your compost pile, but they are good because they do add nitrogen. So if your compost pile is really slow, grass clippings might speed it up. And certainly leaves, we're going to have a lot of those, and they can go in a compost pile, as well as used potting soil, manure, sawdust, hair, those types of things. So all of this stuff that we're going to be dealing with in the next few weeks, cleaning up our gardens, putting our garden to bed, it can go in the compost pile. But the green stuff speeds it up and adds more nitrogen. So that one picture I think is supposed to be green leaves there and the grass clippings. And also there's alfalfa pellets there. I don't know if I would go to the extent of buying those and putting those in, but they're going to be a little more higher in nitrogen. So the nitrogen level, if we raise that by adding some of these green materials, the compost pile will speed up and our decomposers will act faster, and our process of compost making will happen faster. Okay, there's also lots of other things you can put in there. Shredded paper, newspaper is okay. Certainly that can be recycled, and some people will make the case that it's better to recycle paper because you're using it in maybe a more important way than putting it in a compost pile. But sometimes if I happen to have paper that's maybe a little dirty for some reason, I might put that in my compost pile. Dryer lint, newspaper, peanut shells, of course they're organic, right? Coffee grounds and filters, tea bags, pet hair, all things that can go in the compost pile. But then there are a few things to avoid. And certainly there are people that do compost these items, and they can be composted, but starting out, or maybe for the novice person, they're a little bit better to avoid. Oil, fat, grease, meat, fish, dairy products, you know, they can be composted, but they might be a little stinkier. They might be something that will draw perhaps some wildlife that would be maybe not desirable. Maybe you're going to find some creatures out there digging these things up or causing some problems, and that might be a good thing to avoid. And also hard to kill weeds. I talked about throwing weeds in there, but again, if I had quack grass, which has a big rhizome, and I'm going to dig that up and I've got these rhizomes to deal with, I'm not going to put that in my compost pile because that could survive the process and come back to haunt me. And weeds that have gone to seed, I tend to not put those in my compost pile. Also, dog and cat waste, a good thing to avoid, and disease or insect-ridden plants. Now, probably something that has a lot of insect damage is not going to really be that big of a deal because those insects are going to die. Whether the insect eggs will survive the compost process, I don't know, but I would avoid that. And certainly diseased matter. If I had some really diseased tomato plants, I don't think I would put that in my compost pile. You know, they'll tell you to put that in a bag and take that to the trash. Or again, if you have enough property, I have a nasties pile. I just put that in the nasties pile. Also, sometimes people want to put lime in their compost pile. Increases the compost pH and promotes ammonia odor problems. I've never done that, so I don't know that firsthand, but why would you want to put lime in there? I think for some reason people get that idea in their head and they want to do it. Not necessary. Wood ash also will raise the pH more than you want, so don't put that in there. And your compost, like that stuff in the bag I showed you, is going to finish out to be about a pH 7, which is neutral, which is really nice. And we don't really want to raise that pH any more than we've got a 7, so that's good. How about shredding? This is a gentleman here. He's out with some sort of a shredder machine, and he's got a pile of organic matter there, shredding it up. Well, that will make the compost pile work a little faster because the microbes will have more surface area of that material, and they'll break it down faster. But maybe, probably not really necessary unless you've got some really coarse material. Twigs or stems. I don't tend to put woody stuff in my compost pile. Ornamental grasses, now that's a good one. If I had some ornamental grasses that were very heavy, that would be a great thing to ship or shred if you were going to put that in a compost pile, because that's certainly compostable, but it's a little bit heavy. But shredding isn't really necessary unless you've got some heavy duty stuff. And in the white there, it talks about how things can be compacted, and actually coarse material has more aeration to it. So if you add a lot of shredded material, you're going to actually have less air in your compost pile, and that's not such a good thing. Okay, and that's what it's saying here. Smaller particles will also decrease airflow, and you'll have to turn your pile more. So shredding is maybe a double-edged sword. Okay, this picture talks about the browns and the greens, and that's kind of how I like to think about composting. Carbon-rich organic wastes are known as browns, and the nitrogen-rich organic wastes are known as the greens. And here we get to the carbon-nitrogen ratio, or the CN ratio, where N is always 1. And this is just a little bit of a scientific way to talk about some of these materials. Brown materials, leaves, straw, paper, sawdust, they tend to be very dry, high in carbon, 30, 40, 150 parts of carbon to 1 part of nitrogen. So they're very tough, and they're going to take a long time to break down. The decomposers are bacteria, fungi, and actinomycetes are going to have a time to work on these guys, and they're going to have some energy to do that. And the energy to do that is going to come from the greens, because these have lower amounts of carbon and therefore more nitrogen in them. So vegetable scraps, coffee grounds, grass clippings, these are going to be the things that speed up the compost pile. And certainly manure has a lot of nitrogen in it. So manure certainly isn't really green in color, but we call it a green here because it has a fair amount of nitrogen to it. So if your compost pile is working very slowly, you might have too many browns versus greens, so you would add more green material. That could be one solution, okay? And I see in that picture there, there's eggshells, and I forgot to say that eggshells are good to put in your compost along with your other food scraps. So the browns decay slowly. Coarse browns can keep the pile aerated. I'll show you that with the leaves. We get a lot of these in the fall, and they do tie up the nitrogen, so we can mix them with the greens if we want the pile to move a little faster. If we have too many greens, though, we can have poor aeration and odors. I always think about the grass clippings. If we put a big load of grass clippings into a compost pile and don't work them into the brown material, we're going to have that stinky odor as they start to heat up and become anaerobic, which is not such a good thing. We have more greens in the spring and summer, and they're best if they're mixed with the browns. So we get to this part, and here we talk about different styles, I guess I would say, of composting. And you don't have to do this first style. This is kind of the high-tech composting. This is when we want to make compost quickly, and we're really a hot shot composter. Maybe we do something called hot composting or aerobic composting. And this is composting with the decomposers that need oxygen. And we're going to really get this pile churning and moving. Well, it doesn't literally move, but you know what I mean. We're really going to get this compost working quickly. And we're not going to have foul odors, and we're going to have heat generated by our decomposers. So how do we do this fast composting or hot composting or aerobic composting? Well, it's really kind of an interesting process. The pile, if we have it made correctly, and we have the right amount of moisture, air, and the right mix of materials, is going to start to heat up. And the compost pile is going to go from something like 55 degrees, where it's just starting to really break things down, and it's going to heat up as those microorganisms get to work, and it's going to go up to 140 degrees. And that 55 to 140 in this slide is where you want to be. That's the ideal range for composting. That's when it's going to be happening at its peak. Now, sometimes these microbes can get working so well that they kind of overheat, and they go up to maybe 155 or so, and then they kind of crash. They don't like that higher temperature, and then they tend to go back down, or the pile goes back down in temperature. One of the interesting things about this picture is that there's a thermometer there. Now, if you're a hot shot composter and you have a compost pile and you want to see if it's heating up, you can buy one of these thermometers with a long probe on it, and you would poke that into your compost pile and say, what temperature is it? And if you were between that 55 and 140, you would be happy. And if it got above 140, you might want to turn that compost pile and get a little more air in there, bring it back down in temperature, and then it's going to reheat up again if it has more work to do. So in the script there, it says, to get the most active and rapid composting, the pile should be turned when the temperature begins to drop, or if the temperature rises above 140, or maybe every 6 to 12 weeks. So there you go. And this is kind of a fun graphic here that shows, you know, the first week we make our compost pile, and if we have done it correctly in order to make this hot compost, the temperature is going to go up. And of course, they have it in Celsius here, which I don't remember from graduate school. So it's going up 58, I think is the highest point there, 137 degrees. And that's going to be for several weeks. And then that's going to come back down in temperature. So, you know, that's not going too high. If it went too high, we would have to turn it, and we would get some fluctuation in our graph there. But this is kind of a composting in an ideal world, I guess you would say. And again, you don't have to do it this way. And I'll show you how the lazy people like me make compost towards the end. Some more fun words here. The mesophilic phase is the moderate temperature in the beginning. It becomes thermophilic, and that's really a reflection of thermophilic, meaning that the bacteria and the other microorganisms in there are heat-loving at that point. And then when it goes back down in temperature, there's actually different microbes that you can find at the different temperatures. So that's kind of interesting. I don't know that we need to spend a whole lot more time on this heating up effect, but that's fast composting. Now, if I ran a municipal compost pile and I had a big tractor, a big backloader, a big machine, and people were bringing me leaves and grass clippings, and I was piling them up into one of these giant piles, I could turn them with my big machine, I could put water on them, and I could get this big pile to turn and heat up and make compost in a few weeks. And that's a really interesting process, and it can be done on a large scale. If anybody's seen that, I've been to a number of those places over the years, and it's really interesting to see how big piles of leaves and yard waste can be turned into compost very rapidly by managing these factors. So then we get to this point, and it says, does my compost pile have to get hot? Well, good compost can be made in a pile that never gets hot, but it will happen slower and take longer, and not enough air, too little or too much water, or too many browns in the mix to keep the pile from heating. Well, that's really what happens in my pile, which I'll show you in a few minutes. It's a pile that probably gets too dry sometimes, and it's a pile that has too many browns in it. it does compost, it just takes a long time. But if I wanted to my pile to go and make compost faster, I would be doing some of the things we just talked about. There are advantages to the hot compost though, because that's the most rapid, and it will also be where if we can kill some of the disease organisms and the weed seeds, that will happen. So we will come back to this cool composting in a minute. But let's just finish talking about the hot compost. And one of the most exciting parts here is these folks are doing real compost science. They've got a steaming pile there. The microbes are working furiously. And I don't know what exactly they're doing in those pictures, but maybe they want to turn that pile because it's gotten too hot if their thermometer tells them that. So you can see the steaming effect is quite interesting to see. And if you ever did visit that big municipal compost pile, that would be a very common thing to see it steaming like that. But again, if it gets over 155, that's not so good for the microorganisms, and they tend to overheat, and then the pile starts to go down anyway. So, question, does hot composting kill the weed seeds? Well, I looked this up at Cornell, which is the font of all knowledge, of course, and it said, it is generally easier to keep weed seeds out of the compost pile than to make sure you kill them. Well, I think that's very wise and very down-to-earth advice. So don't throw your weed seeds in there. Be aware of what you're throwing in, and you'll have less problems. But this is kind of a complicated chart they've got here for us. And it does say, if we get up to that 140 degrees, just for an hour or two, the weed seeds will be killed. But if our compost pile never really heats up, the weed seeds will not be killed. So there you go. If you have a compost pile that you are going to try to get to heat up, you probably will kill your weed seeds. But if your compost pile doesn't heat up, they're going to be in there because weed seeds can live for a long time. If you've ever endured my weed talk, I have a picture that talks about, you know, weed seeds can live 20, 30, 40, 50 years. And, you know, a weed seed that is born in 2020 might still be viable in 2050. So weed seeds tend to be very tough. So the low or the slow composting is not going to kill those guys. How about pathogens? Does hot composting kill the pathogens? Yes. And I won't read that whole picture there, but basically there's been a number of studies done that say if you have hot composting, it gets up into that 140 range, it will kill most of the fungi and bacteria that are bad for plants. Okay, how about air? Now we mentioned air and water were important to a compost pile. Again, if you want to do the hot composting, you want to get some air through that pile. And this graphic is showing a compost pile on a raised platform. If you look really carefully at that picture, you can kind of see that that compost pile made out of some wire mesh there in a circular form is on some planks, and there's air coming up through the bottom. So a lot of times compost piles don't work fast because there's not enough air, but here we've got sort of this natural flow of ventilation giving us air in the pile. I like this graphic here too because they've got corn stalks, they've got pipes with holes in them stuck in their compost pile, and again, that's to get some more aeration. So if you want to do the hot composting and you are concerned about aeration, which you should be, you might put a perforated pipe in your compost pile, and that's going to just be a natural way to get some more air through that pile. There's also these gizmos, and the gentleman there is using a pitchfork on the left, but the gizmos on the right-hand side, at least in my picture, they look sort of like a T-shaped tool, and they have these little feet on them, I guess I would call them. You jam that T-shaped compost turner into your pile, and when you pull it out, those feet flip out, and they kind of pop the compost and make some more air space in there. And back in Westchester, we had a compost demonstration pile. We had different types of bins, and we had some of those aeration tools, and they actually did work. So if you are a tool gizmo and you like buying tools, maybe you'll buy yourself one of those for the holidays. And then there's water, and I know my compost pile dries out too much. Think about this summer. We had this drought for weeks and weeks. And, you know, my compost pile was just as dry as a bone, right? Because it didn't rain. Ideally, if we wanted to have compost that works quickly, our compost would be as wet as a wrung out sponge. I love that terminology there. So if it's too dry, we add a little water when we turn the pile. And if it's too wet, we can turn the pile and dry it out. But I think for the most part, my pile tends to be too dry. So here they are showing adding a little water. And this is a great picture of the wrung out sponge. There's some leafy material, it looks like browns really, and they're squeezing it and, you know, kind of getting the idea of how wet it should be. So it should be kind of damp, and my compost pile is far from the hose, and I don't really have a way to add water to it. So that's one of my other reasons why it's a slow compost pile. So taking care of your compost, again, mixing browns and greens, regularly turning it, or maybe making some provision to get air through it and giving it a little water. When pile no longer heats after mixing, allow it to stand to cure. Now that's something that people might not think about, but if you've got this hot compost pile, it turns into the stuff that I had in the bag. Let it sit for another week or two, maybe a month, and just let it cure and finish really and stabilize. Okay, so making compost the fast way, we've talked about this a lot. Turn the pile frequently. It should heat up to 140, and then it's going to go down in temperature and continue to compost, and then you're going to let it sit and cure for a few weeks. So I think it's kind of a fun idea. I've never, well, actually I have gotten compost piles to heat up and get going. I've never really done it consistently because it does take a lot of work. And quite honestly, I'd rather be probably working in my garden or riding my bike. But some people like to compost, that's their hobby. Maybe we'll inspire somebody here tonight and will become a compost guru. So when is it finished? It's finished when it looks like the stuff I had in the bag. It's crumbly, it's loose, has an earthy smell, or really not too much smell at all. It doesn't contain too many remnants of what went into the pile. A few little twigs or sticks are okay, and it really has shrunken down in volume. Okay, where should I put my compost pile? Well, that's a good question. If you put it in the shade, it might help it from drying out in the summer. Avoid areas that will interfere with lawn and garden activities. Usually not something you want to put right in the middle of your garden. Put it in a work area, an area that's used for storage. And ideally, you would have some water available, but that's not always easy to do. And do you really want to show it to the neighbors? I think you want to put it someplace maybe a little hidden. This talks about putting it away from wells. I wouldn't worry about that too much. You're not going to be composting huge amounts, and I wouldn't worry about that too much. If I had millions of cubic yards of compost, that might be an issue. Be a good neighbor. Keep it out of your neighbor's view. I'm not actually a good neighbor. I have it kind of close to the main road here, and I think people can see my compost pile when they drive by, but that's okay. Okay, let's show some pictures here about what a pile might look like. It can be made out of blocks, it can be made out of snow fence, it can be made out of wire mesh, usually 3 to 4 feet, or maybe up to 5 feet on a side. If your compost pile gets bigger than 5 feet by 5 feet by 5 feet, it tends not to have good aeration. So kind of this 3 to 4 foot range is a good size and manageable for most people. And use whatever materials you have. If you happen to have some snow fence around or wire or blocks, you can make a compost pile. Now here's a fancy rotating bin the lady is dusting snow off of. You can make compost in that bin because you're going to turn that bin easily. It's going to spin around and aerate for you, but you're not going to make a whole lot of compost, and my garden waste wouldn't fit in that bin. I need a much bigger pile. But if you have a small yard, that might be good. There's all sorts of sizes and shapes of this kind of thing that you can use. There's a lot of fancy plastic bins on the market. I think they tend to work better in smaller yards or smaller gardens. If you've got a bigger yard, you're going to want some bigger sort of bin, I think. Here's the earth machine. I don't think we would be really turning that. We would have to rely on the natural aeration to aerate that compost. And that rotating barrel, there's a picture of that again. That's a really nice unit, but it costs a lot of money. So if you're really have somebody that likes you a lot, maybe they'll buy you that for your birthday. Here's our bins that were recently reconstructed by Bob Sherwood and Richard Demick at our demonstration garden. These are lovely compost bins, and I think they're about 4.5 feet on a side, and we've got lots of compost being made there. And you can go look at those at the Parker School. And just some more pictures. The 3-bin system is kind of the idea there is you're going to have raw materials, you're going to have compost working, and maybe finished compost in the 3rd bin. Lots of different variations. And here I just wanted to show you some different ways to make layers of compost. If you want to make a hot pile, one of the ways you can do that is to make layers of materials and let them sit, and they'll compost. And they might even work without aeration or turning. Now, that you'd have to experiment with. And some of these I just got off the internet. So if you look up compost piles on the internet, you can get sort of these diagrams. And basically what they're talking about is putting layers of organic materials and sometimes soil or fertilizer or manure. So greens and browns together. Here's New Mexico University, and they talk about adding fertilizer. That's another thing that would be considered a green or a stimulant to a compost pile. So that's one method. Here's one similar but different. Let It Rot. That's our book that I showed you by Stu Campbell. Making layers 6 inches at a time, vegetable matter, manure, and earth. Now, I don't happen to have manure handy, but if I did, that would be a wonderful way to make a compost pile that would certainly heat up. And he's sealing it over with straw or sod. Tennessee Department of Agriculture, 6 to 12 inches of leaves topped with 1 to 2 inches of soil or manure. And then they're putting a little fertilizer on it, and they've added the perforated pipe and indicated some water there. Here's one from North Carolina, 4 feet on a side, leaves, browns, greens, layered there. And this one I just kind of love because this is somebody scratched this out with a magic marker. And it's 2 meters on a side. It's 6 feet tall and 6 feet wide. That's too big. But again, their idea is leaves and greens and browns alternating. And this one, I don't know what this language is, but I thought this was fascinating because here we have composting in any language is kind of the same. So those are piles that would be manufactured in layers, very fancy type of composting, and certainly we don't have to do it that way because here's my compost pile. Okay, now you don't have to be as lazy as me, but this is how a lazy person composts. This is a long pile, or a long bin, I guess I should say. On the far end there, we've got finished compost on the left that's ready to be used. In the middle, I've got my material that's composting, and you can see in the spring here, I've really got mostly brown material there. We've gotten through winter, and I haven't put a lot of green material in there, but that's going to be the stuff that's slowly breaking down. And then on the right-hand side, that's a section that really is almost finished compost as well, but I could screen that out and get some of the coarser material out of that, and then I would have more finished compost. And one of the useful tools that I have is one of these screens. This is made out of hardware cloth. This is, the one on the left is big enough to fit on top of my wheelbarrow. So it's about 3 feet or 3.5 feet maybe on a side. And I put my compost through that hardware cloth, which is I think 3/8 inch hardware cloth, and I screen out some of the bits. So I have a lot of browns in my compost pile in the spring, but then I'm adding food scraps. And the way I add food scraps to my compost pile is I just kind of throw them on top or bury them in lightly, and then I put a little more brown material on top. And I just keep making these layers and letting that green material or the food scraps kind of be in the center and start to do its work. Okay, so there I'm covering my food scraps to discourage wildlife, and I don't really have too much problems with wildlife getting in my compost bin. And there's my finished compost. But this, of course, took years to make because this is the slow method. This compost pile never heated up, but yet it did make really good compost. So if you want to do it this way, this is the way to do it with very little effort. And I think this is the way most people do compost because this is really much easier than trying to get it to heat up. Of course, you always have just some debris. No matter how careful you are, There's bits of wood that get in there, maybe some plastic nursery labels or a brick or some stones, and you just screen that out and there's no big deal. But one thing that I'm bad about is sometimes having weeds grow on my compost pile, and that's such a no-no, David. You know, you get weeds growing on your compost pile. Not only are they stealing some of the nutrients out of the compost, but they're making seeds. So, you know, I'm very lax about that to my own detriment. Don't be like me. Keep your compost that's not being used yet covered, maybe, to keep the weeds out of it. So how do you use compost? Well, here I am on the left adding compost to my raised bed before I plant in the spring. And I'm going to put maybe 2 inches across the top and turn it in. I could do that in the spring, and I might actually do that again in the fall if I have the time and energy to do it. Couple inches of compost really is what you want to do there. And then on the right-hand side, that's an area in my garden where I had a shrub that I took out. It was getting too big, and I'm going to add some compost in that area before I replant the shrub. And again, maybe dump about 2 inches over the top and work it in. It's going to do some really nice benefits for my soil. So let's take a veer off the course here a little bit and talk about composting food scraps. These are really valuable for your compost pile. And what we do at home is we collect the scraps in a bucket that looks a little bit like that one in the picture. Some people store them in the refrigerator. We don't have enough space, so we just keep them in the bucket, take them outside every day or every other day, bring that bucket out to the compost pile and dump them in. It's really very simple, and it gets you outside and seeing what the weather is like. Now, there are fancier ways to do this, and one of them is this green cone composter, or they call it the solar digester here. And the idea is that the gentleman is adding his food scraps to the top of the cone. He's not going to really turn that or incorporate that, but that's going to be sort of a sealed system. It's going to be varmint proof, and it's going to compost and make a nice product down in the bottom there. So the green cone is kind of this sealed system. I believe they talk about this being, is it anaerobic or aerobic? I guess it's aerobic. I actually had this at our demonstration garden, or our demonstration in Westchester County, but we really never got it to work right because we didn't have enough food scraps. It was at a county park, so we didn't have food scraps at the county park. But I think this is an interesting idea if you want to compost food scraps on their own. You can also incorporate them in the soil. They talk about methods here where you can dig a trench in your garden, dump the food scraps in there, cover it over, and then let it sit for a while and eventually replant in that area. Now, you know, a lot of people don't have a huge volume, but they have a little bit every day. If you had a big garden and you had blank spaces or empty spaces in your garden, you could probably do that. And the lady there is doing the same thing kind of in a raised bed. So incorporating food scraps, that's a way to use them in a garden. And this is a different system. I just read about this. I really don't know much about it, but it's called Bokashi, and I'm sure I'm saying that wrong. But it's Japanese for fermented organic matter. It's composting in a sealed bucket. And the Japanese are very good at doing very precise things in small spaces, if I may say that. So we have a bucket, and we compost anaerobically in this bucket. And there's a whole system to do this. If you're interested in this, I would Google Bokashi bucket composting. And I've got a link there that was done by some master gardeners in New Mexico that talk about how to do this composting system. So if you lived in an apartment and if you didn't have outdoor space and if you wanted to compost, this is a way to do it inside your house. And supposedly it doesn't smell too badly unless you take that lid off at the wrong time. But the whole idea is to make layers in that bucket and keep the lid on most of the time and have it be anaerobic and not use air. Then I just wanted to give a shout out to vermicomposting or worm composting. These are using red wigglers, and this is done again inside a home usually. We don't want to let these freeze. And it's very popular in classrooms. You can take newspaper and some kitchen scraps and give these worms that are in your worm bin this material, and then they break it down and make wonderful compost. So there's a great book, I hope it's still around, called Worms Eat My Garbage. Wonderful title, by a woman named Mary Applehoff. I actually met Mary Applehoff probably in about 1990, and she wrote a wonderful book talking about worms eat my garbage. So that's a great project, especially for kids, and it is another way to compost food scraps. When I've done that, I found that the fruit flies can be a little bit of a problem if you're not keeping your lid on tightly and incorporating your food scraps well enough. So it is a little tricky, but it can be kind of fun. So let's just finish up here talking about some of the benefits of compost. I think you've probably got the idea. It's a great thing. It's a great soil amendment. It attracts earthworms and microorganisms. That increases your water holding capacity and your nutrient holding capacity. Your plants will love it. It makes the soil more crumbly. It loosens heavy soils, improves drainage, adds water holding capacity to very sandy soil, and sometimes can suppress pathogens. So soil, or compost I should say, is not a fertilizer, but it does have small amounts of nitrogen and phosphorus, and that will be released to the plants. It also contains micronutrients, so those are all good for the plants. And how do we use it? Well, again, you might put maybe 2, 3, 4 inches across your garden and till it in. You might use it when you plant in the spring. You might use it again in the fall. Okay, you might use it as a surface mulch. Here they talk about putting 3 inches around a tree. Now, I'm not really crazy about using compost as a mulch. I use shredded leaves for that, but some people might use compost, and it has some benefits there. You can put it on your lawn if you have a fine compost without a lot of bits in it. You might put a 1/4 inch across your lawn, and that will supply nutrients to your lawn. You might use it as a potting mix. Use about 1/3 in your compost mix or your potting mix, and some people like to do that. But again, if it hasn't heated up, it may not be great for starting seeds. So I would use it for larger seedlings or mature plants, things I'm going to grow in nursery pots rather than seedlings. And just a shout out about these autumn leaves. Of course, you can compost these, but here's pictures of people raking them to the curb. And man, that is such a waste of organic matter. Yeah, it may be picked up and recycled or composted, but we need to use a lot of gas and oil and big trucks and people power to do that. So it's not really efficient, not really green. Here's people putting out these bags, and I know master gardeners that actually collect these bags and take them home and put them in their own compost piles, which I think is a wonderful act of subversion. But one other thing you can do with leaves is leave them on your lawn and chop them up with your lawnmower. It's not really composting per se, but leaving leaves on your lawn and chopping them up is a way to deal with them, especially if you have no more than about 6 inches on the lawn. And if you have grass clippings on your lawn, that's okay too. This is a picture of my mulching mower, and it's okay to leave your clippings on the lawn unless they get very clumpy. Okay, now I didn't mention this before, but Cornell has a great website with all sorts of composting information. So that's listed here. Now I would just use my searcher, my Google or whatever I was going to use, and type in Cornell Waste Management Institute, or just type in Cornell Composting, and you'll get to this website with lots of information. Okay, so that was a lot there. Here we are back at the beginning, and again, if anybody wants to send me an email, that would be wonderful. My email is dhc3@cornell.edu.